For those of you who are on Zoom or just for the sake of the recording, I'm not sure what James was saying, but I'm just a guy who loves beauty. And I love the arts and I love creation. So what I tried to do in my latest book is try to put some words to that because I think it's difficult to talk about beauty. It's everywhere. It's essential, but there's so many arguments about what beauty is, it's hard to cut through them sometimes. And I'm really interested in what beauty does, what impact beauty has on our lives. And that's really what I was trying to do in Beauty is Oxygen, this book. And so, what I want to do for you tonight is to provide a bit of a framework for how I think about beauty. I'll sprinkle that with some readings from the book, and I just hope and pray it can incite some really good dialogue and encouragement for you. And perhaps maybe I just want to start with this question for you. I'm curious if you can try for a minute to imagine a world without beauty. I mean, try to imagine a world in which every building looks the same, every song sounds the same, every meal tastes the same, every interaction feels the same, every plant smells the same. It's essentially impossible, right? A world without beauty would be a world of sameness. It would be a world without any kind of significant form to it, which really isn't a world at all, or at least not a world we can easily imagine. And the world is this way because it's the overflow of God's beauty. That's what I believe. The world is just the overflow, the excess of a God who is beauty. And if that's true, and if beauty is such an essential part of our lives and the world we live in, then why do we treat beauty as optional? Why do we approach beauty as marginal or tangential, perhaps to issues of health, of flourishing, spiritual formation, community, justice? And of course, not everyone does that, and not every portion of the Christian tradition and other religions treat beauty this way, but tragically, I think it's much more common than not to treat beauty more like perfume than like oxygen. So bear with me for a moment as I talk about these metaphors. If beauty is like perfume, then beauty is something there to adorn our lives rather than to sustain it. If beauty is perfume, then it's something that perhaps I'm allowed to enjoy once I figured out necessary things, serious things like truth and morality and justice. Certainly, if beauty is like perfume, it's something that's subjective, according to whatever I like, whatever my preference is, versus something objective. Beauty, if beauty is perfume, it's a luxury for the privileged, but it's essentially unnecessary for everyone. And I don't think that's what beauty is. I think that beauty is much, much more than that. And it's much more like oxygen, which for me means at least five things. Metaphors keep unfolding their meaning, right? So I keep discovering more as I think about this and talk about it, but at least five things. So if beauty is oxygen, then beauty is necessary. It's not trivial. It's not optional. Beauty is what forms our desires, our imaginations, our attachments. And if God is beauty, then beauty is an essential feature of this world that God created and an essential feature of our lives as image bearers of God. So beauty is oxygen because it's essential. It's also everywhere. It's not just in places or situations that we deem pleasant or nice. It is in the atmosphere, as it were, everywhere. Third, beauty is a gift. Just like oxygen, we didn't do anything to deserve it. We just were born. And beauty is just there, and it's constantly sustaining our lives. So beauty is oxygen because it's necessary. It's everywhere. It's a gift. I would add, I think it's spiritual. I think that beauty comes from the spirit. The scriptures, Hebrew scriptures call ruach. In Greek, it's pneuma. In both of those languages, this word for spirit means breath, means wind, atmosphere even. The idea is that God breathes out beauty and we breathe it in as oxygen for our lives, as oxygen for our souls. And then fifth, just to throw a little wrench in it, I think beauty is dangerous. Talk to any diver and they'll tell you about the danger of oxygen poisoning, getting too much oxygen, right? And I think similarly for beauty, there's only so much we can take, but there's only so much beauty we can take in the right way and in the right time. Think of, for example, Moses, who wanted to see God's beauty, wanted to see God's glory. And God gave him a tiny little glimpse of his back. Why? Because I think the full brunt of God's beauty would annihilate us. And if we take in too much beauty too quickly, not taking time to process it, enjoy it, we can suffer from a form of beauty poisoning. People ask me often how to properly enjoy art, and because I think some people find it difficult. How do I go to an art museum and know what I'm looking at and enjoy it? And it often feels very exhausting. And I think that's interesting because part of the reason I think why people are so exhausted sometimes when they go to an art museum is they just try to do too much. They just try to take in too much, and we're not meant to. So beauty is dangerous, and that helps us tread carefully, and it helps us tread with humility and respect as we talk about it. We need beauty as oxygen for our souls, in particular, because there's just so much in life that makes it hard to breathe, because of the soul-crushing nature of existence. This is kind of how I start the book. So pages 15 to 17, here's some things that I'm thinking about: the soul-crushing disillusion of a marriage, the soul-crushing doldrums of a day job, the soul-crushing pain of disease, the soul-crushing oppression of the vulnerable, the soul-crushing loss of a child, the soul-crushing violence of racism, the soul-crushing isolation of individualism and loneliness, the soul-crushing futility of advancement, the soul-crushing hatred of others, the soul-crushing abuse of the weak. And yet, this is Terry Tempest Williams, who says, "The world is so beautiful in spite of the troubles." The world is so beautiful in spite of the troubles. And that beauty is oxygen for us in this existence, in this soul-crushing existence. That beauty blows through noxious environments, nestling us everywhere. If only we have eyes to see, ears to hear, noses to smell, tongues to taste, hands to touch. Beauty permeates our lives through every sense. It shimmers through every crack, sounds through every silence, wafts down every street, lingers after every sip, radiates from every surface. Think of the soul-sustaining music of birdsong, the soul-sustaining aroma of a warm spring rain, the soul-sustaining bond between friends, the soul-sustaining wonder of grace, the soul-sustaining silliness of children, the soul-sustaining horizon of the ocean, the soul-sustaining joy of a wedding feast, the soul-sustaining energy of a jazz quartet, the soul-sustaining ache of belly laughter, the soul-sustaining warmth of a winter fire. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has made everything beautiful in its time. That's Ecclesiastes 3:11. So just a little background, if I can back up a little bit, that metaphor, beauty is oxygen, first came to me when I was pastoring a church here in Charlotte, and specifically after enduring a very difficult year. There was a lot of death, the death of a church leader by a motorcycle accident, the death of a college minister friend by a blood clot, the death of a teenager by suicide, the death of a founding member of the church through health complications. So much trauma, so much death. It was an excruciatingly difficult year. And for me, individually and as a community, I discerned that what we needed the most was the healing presence and power of beauty. And so I did this sermon series called Soul Pollution, exploring how beauty is the antidote to whatever clogs up our souls, whether suffering, trauma or despair, but also boredom, consumerism, other things that we wrestle with, other things that clog up our lives. Beauty is oxygen for our polluted lives, for our polluted souls. And so I started thinking about it along those lines, and wanted to keep thinking about it, wanted to write about it then, but now 7 years later, I finally got around to writing this book. And in doing so, I took that initial idea and fleshed out how beauty is oxygen for our souls in an age in which faith, hope, and love are, I think, increasingly difficult. So I write in the book about how beauty is oxygen for buffered, battered, and bored souls. That is my pastor hat again, my love for alliteration. My editor didn't like that, so that didn't end up in the subtitle. She didn't like alliterations as much as I do. But let me tell you about each of those, because I think it'll help you understand where I'm coming from. Buffered, battered, and bored. The first one, buffered, is this idea that we live in a time in which it is harder and harder for the ordinary person to believe that there is a God who is present and active in the world. It used to be the fundamental assumption that there is a God who is present and active in the so-called sacred age, but lots of people are calling our age a secular one, in which I'm essentially on my own to create an identity and to shape a meaningful life, apart from any transcendent source. So this is the idea of the buffered self, that I'm buffered from any transcendent reality outside of myself when it comes to meaning. And so faith within this framework is not trusting in a transcendent source and a transcendent God, but trusting in myself and trusting that I'm enough to figure it out, to get through life. And so this buffered self is a cultural condition that also intersects with, in the Christian tradition, we call the sin condition of being curved in on yourself. Martin Luther describes sin in this way of a self-preoccupation, that we're curved inward rather than curved outward in love and attention to God, others, and his world. So my argument in the book is that within this cultural condition, within the sin condition of being buffered, of being turned inward, that beauty has an unselfing, an unbending, reorienting impact on ourselves. And it opens us up to the possibility of transcendence and a God who breaks into our world, a wonder-making God. So that's what I mean by buffered. When it comes to battered self, This is simply the struggle of navigating a broken world with all of the traumas that we carry from various wounds, the various conditions that make it hard to breathe, right? So this could be relational trauma, could be racial trauma, environmental trauma, sexual trauma, political trauma. It's our souls crying out for hope and freedom from the various things that make it difficult for us to breathe. And for the battered self, for the battered soul, my argument is that beauty can bring healing and beauty can bring hope. So buffered corresponds to the struggle and the journey of faith. Battered relates to the journey of hope and how beauty enters in there. And then finally, the bored self names, in a lot of ways, the kind of soul weariness that results from being buffered and battered. That boredom or apathy arises when you just don't see the point anymore. And we try to address boredom through entertainment or through busyness or through advancement. But what we really long for is joy and love and beauty within the ordinary moments, within the ordinary places, that deep down within our experience of boredom is a desire to experience love, which begins with attention and astonishment to ordinary moments and ordinary people, all of which is really quite extraordinary. This is how beauty helps us see again. So that's the context of the book. I'm thinking about pastorally as well as theologically. And I summarize that just toward the end of chapter 1. Perhaps this will be helpful for me to read. Just a couple paragraphs on this. So beauty is oxygen for people who struggle to find meaning beyond the self, coming like a fresh breeze into the suffocating atmosphere of me, myself, and I. To encounter beauty of any kind, whether in creation or the arts, is an opportunity to experience a radical unselfing. While encounters with beauty can have deep emotional impact, beauty is far more than therapeutic. It moves us beyond self-centeredness, liberates us from illusions of control, and brings us into transformative encounters with the God who draws near within our material world. Then beauty is oxygen for people who struggle to find and maintain hope. True beauty is not sentimental, and it carries along with it the wounds of our existence, as we see in the person of Christ. So in times of racialized violence, environmental crisis, growing inequalities, the beauty of the arts and creation can bear witness to a weighty, anchored hope, one that does not evade the reality of evil and injustice. Beauty can awaken us to see things as they currently are, while also giving glimpses of how things could and indeed will be. And these visions can then activate our individual imaginations and collective will for costly action within situations of oppression, suffering, trauma, and injustice. And finally, beauty is oxygen for people who struggle with boredom or just find little to love with abandon. Beauty allows us to breathe deeply within ordinary times and places. Rather than moving from one meaningless day and season to another, we can be filled with wonder when we are alert to the beauty of creation and the glory of ordinary things. One poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, writes that there is a dearest freshness deep down things, despite the fact that all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. And in addition, by participating in the beauty of worship, we learn and embrace our role in a drama, the drama of God within the mundane, where the story of each day is caught up in a cosmic drama of loss and renewal. So I hope that's helpful in framing just where I'm coming from and how I think about the impact of beauty in our journey of faith. hope, and love. And in writing about this, this has been frustrating for some people. I intentionally do not linger on what beauty is because I think as a theologian, I'm recognizing that many theological discussions of beauty kind of struggle to get past that, what beauty is, because there's a lot to say, and they never get to what beauty does and what impact beauty has. But I address it in brief, and essentially, I believe that God is beauty, and that the beauty that we encounter in our lives in the world is traces of divine glory, both in the natural world and in human culture and artistry. And those traces of divine glory are marked by this alluring wholeness of entangled forms and experiences and ideas. Theologians wrestle and wrangle over that, often in dialogue with philosophy. But I think perhaps an even better dialogue partner when it comes to beauty is poetry. So I rely a lot on poetry in thinking about beauty and in talking about beauty. And I'd like to introduce you to a poem this evening by Christian Wyman. He's one of the best contemporary poets in the world. He's also written several books that, if you're interested in this intersection of faith and art, I cannot commend them to you enough. I'm going to, if I'm able to share my screen. Am I a co-host? Should have asked that before. I think I am. Okay, cool. Yeah, I can. The reason I want to share my screen, I think a lot of poetry needs to be seen, as well as heard. So can you see that? Can you see that screen coming up? I see some nods. Awesome. Okay, good. So this poem by Christian Wyman is called Every Riven Thing. I'd like to read it and talk about how this forms my view of beauty. God goes, belonging to every riven thing he's made, sing his being simply by being the thing it is. Stone and tree and sky, man who sees and sings and wonders why God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of the atoms inside the stone. Think of a man who sits alone, trying to will himself into a stillness where God goes belonging. To every riven thing he's made, there is given one shade, shaped exactly to the thing itself. Under the tree, a darker tree. Under the man, the only man to see, God goes belonging to every riven thing. He's made the things that bring him near, made the mind that makes him go, a part of what man knows, apart from what man knows. God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made. I would encourage you to revisit that poem. It's remarkable. I think it's one of the best poems ever written, if I can say that. Obviously, is repeating this line, God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made. And if that's true, if God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made, then God's beauty goes belonging to every riven thing he's made. This was transformative for me in thinking about it this way, because if we embrace that notion, it will push our conception of beauty in several really important directions. Okay, so first, it takes beauty beyond the subjective. God goes belonging. God's beauty goes belonging, which means beauty involves, but is not limited to, our subjective perception and reception. We can recognize and receive beauty because it is given and because it's revealed by God. And there may be varying responses to beauty, but God's beauty goes belonging to the world, whether we recognize it or not. Okay. So I think that's really important. Second, it takes beauty beyond the static. God's beauty goes. It's on the move. Beauty appears and then hides. It arrives as a gift over and over again. And this is really important because beauty cannot be contained, cannot be controlled, can't be grasped, and requires a posture of ongoing receptivity and attentiveness. Third, it takes beauty beyond the abstract. God's beauty goes belonging. This beauty is not some ethereal, formless sublime, but a particular way God goes belonging within the wholeness of our entangled lives. So beauty is not a distraction from particulars, is what I'm saying. And I think Wyman does this beautifully in the poem. Beauty draws us into an infinite drama that is unfolding in our finite lives. And Wyman describes this as stone and tree and sky, man who sees and sings and wonders why, right? This is where beauty is. So I love it. It takes beauty beyond the what did I say? Subjective. It takes beauty beyond the static, takes beauty beyond the abstract. And finally, perhaps most importantly, in some ways, for our contemporary struggle, it takes beauty beyond the pleasant. God's beauty goes belonging to every riven thing. Beauty goes belonging to storms as well as sunsets. God's beauty is there in dissonance as well as harmony. Perhaps it's easier to see how God's beauty goes belonging to riveted things, things that are all put together and tidy. But speaking theologically, if Jesus, as the author of Hebrews confesses, is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his nature, and this Jesus was riven by crucifixion, then God's beauty goes belonging to wounds as well as empty tombs. This is transformative for how we think about beauty. Beauty is oxygen by coming to us within the mess of life, the untidiness of life. And the entangled wholeness of beauty encompasses every riven thing. It's not to say that everything is beautiful, but that beauty can emerge from within everything. So, going back to the genesis of this book, I would never say that all of those experiences back in 2016, all of those deaths and tragedies, those were not beautiful. But what did God go belonging to those riven moments, to those riven experiences? Did beauty emerge from it by some act of grace and mystery? Yeah, I think it did. I think God did. And so that's an important distinction. Our traumatic experiences are not beautiful, but somehow God goes belonging and his beauty goes belonging in and through and out of every riven thing. And this is really important because the concept of beauty has been misused and abused in lots of different ways. It's been limited by narrow categories like proportion and harmony and symmetry. It's been reduced to personal preference. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's been linked with particular forms of so-called high art as opposed to popular or folk art. It's been claimed as the purview of a privileged class of people who can access and afford high art. It's been disassociated from its function in everyday life, this idea of art for art's sake. It's been attached to certain kind of bodies, skinny and proportionate and white. It's been leveraged for oppressive agendas. It's been reduced to whatever produces pleasant feelings. I mean, beauty has a tough history in civilization and in thought. And so, for these reasons and more, I think it's important to be careful, and it's important to recover really what beauty is, so that artists and anyone who's creative, which means any human being, can see beauty as a goal of their work and as a goal of their lives. not something to kind of avoid or be embarrassed by. So let's go back to this idea that beauty belongs or emerges from every ribbon thing. I think perhaps the most prevalent misunderstanding or trap when it comes to beauty in our contemporary setting is to view beauty merely as what we like or find pleasant or nice. But that is the trap of sentimentality. It's alive and well within the Christian tradition, within society as a whole. But sentimentality deprives beauty of its power. So according to one theologian, musician, Jeremy Begbie, he says that sentimentality, it trivializes evil, it placates emotions, it avoids costly action. And you can think of lots of examples. I often talk about the art of Thomas Kinkade. It's kind of an easy punching bag for this sort of thing, but Kinkade, this artist who's known widely as the painter of light, and he claimed to be a Christian. His stated purpose was to bring light into people's lives, making them feel good. And whatever his actual motives, making people feel good is a really good business plan. But Kinkade once attributed the success of his paintings to portraying a world without the fall, without evil, a world with nothing to elicit anxiety. But that's not the world, right? The world of Kinkade paintings is not the world that we live in. It's not even the world experienced by Kinkade himself, who died at the age of 54 from acute intoxication. So Kinkade's art and other forms of art that dabble with sentimentality are failing to put us in touch with true beauty. It's one way of putting it. Because true beauty is what C.S. Lewis called a terrible beauty. And it does not give us a vision that is lacking shadow and lacking struggle. True beauty gives us a vision for how trauma can be transformed, rather than sentimentality just tries to soothe us. Here's what one writer, philosopher said. Calvin Serveld said this about these projects. All such sincere, Sunday schoolish, artificial projects are pseudo-Christian, and their innocuous presentations not only devastate understanding art, but also misrepresent and take the bite and grit and life out of Christian commitment. That's what I keep thinking about. I keep thinking about how genuine beauty has bite and grit. Something that hits you in the gut instead of always eliciting pleasant feelings. So we can think about the magnificent beauty of God that the psalmist says shines forth with fire and tempest. Or I think of the entangled beauty of nature that depends on an endless cycle of life and death and rebirth. I think of the intimate beauty of a relationship that navigates through choppy, nauseating waters of conflict only to arrive on the other side somehow more whole and vibrant. I think of the mysterious and terrifying beauty of a black hole. Like, what is that? I think of the uncontrollable beauty of my children that makes my heart ache because I know that their hearts will break. I think of the sacrificial beauty of a God who chose to be broken for us and enter the abyss. Here's what Mary Oliver wrote. The beauty and strangeness of the world may fill the eyes with its cordial refreshment. Equally, it may offer the heart a dish of terror. On one side is radiance, on another is the abyss. She's saying something incredibly profound theologically because it aligns with what God's beauty is. With the radiance of a resurrected Christ emerging from the dark abyss of death. And for many, that seems like a contradiction. But to go back to Christian Wyman again, it means that our experience of beauty can include what he calls a bright abyss. A bright abyss. We can encounter beauty in the midst of trauma and in the midst of brokenness, and beauty can lead us beyond trauma and give us hope and healing. I'll write about this in the middle of the book. Let me pull up this section. This is in the chapter called Healing Breaths of Fresh Beauty. Why do we need beauty most of all when battered and traumatized? The answer is as complex as trauma, which trauma is essentially the ugly story or the stories we believe, inhabit, and embody because of painful, horrific experiences. In other words, trauma is not merely something that happened, something bad that happened in the past, but the ugliness and the pain that permeates your body and your life in the present. As image bearers of God, we are beauty-breathing beings, but what trauma does is it narrows those airways as well as the attachments through which we experience beauty. The Orthodox theologian Timothy Patitsas explains it this way. He says, in trauma, we find our lives organized around an experience of ugliness, the opposite of the beauty given to us in our relationship with God. We are cut off from the epiphanies that keep our souls awake and breathing, trapped in a life-diminishing prison of ugliness. So exposure to beauty is not a cure-all for traumatized and battered souls, but it is an essential component of holistic healing. Medicine can unlock our brains from debilitating conditions, but it's beauty that draws us into healthy attachments. Analytical modes of therapy can help dismantle false narratives, nurture new ones, but it's beauty that awakens new desires and new loves. Again, Patitsas writes this. He says, the healing of the soul begins with noticing God's many theophanies and with falling in love with them. In other words, it begins with the eros of beauty. In renewing our love for authentic beauty, our character, unraveled by what we have experienced, begins to be knit together and becomes whole again. So that's what I mean when I say beauty is oxygen. We need beauty to breathe and be fully alive. Keep going in the book with this section. Say, people suffer miserably for lack of many things, the most obvious being basic physiological and psychological health. But even if our basic needs are met, we can still suffer miserably from inattentiveness to the everyday epiphanies of God's beauty. Abigail Carroll witnesses to this in her poem, What Men Die for Lack of. We can get healing breaths of beauty from ordinary things like a globed fruit, palpable and mute, or telephone poles holding out their arms to birds, or magenta pokeweed sprung in a vacant lot. The beauty that heals is not merely pleasant, harmonious, luminous, or proportionate. If we conceive of beauty this way, it would be tempting to think that the healing journey involves complete removal from situations and experiences of dissonance, darkness, and disorderedness. But by contrast, beauty is, as David Bentley Hart says, something mysterious, prodigal, often unanticipated, even capricious. We can find ourselves suddenly amazed by some strange and indefinable glory in a barren field, in an urban ruin, in the splendid disarray of a storm-racked forest. In other words, we can encounter beauty within emptiness and fullness, loss and gain, grief and joy. And that is the kind of beauty that heals, and the kind of beauty that provides hope, that can help us to imagine how another world could be possible. And I think this is especially true of the beauty of artistry. Some artists will argue that the aim of their art is just to present reality, right? Rather than aiming at any kind of hope or any kind of other world. But I think art can do both. and it can do both at the same time. In fact, even when an artist is not intending to communicate anything hopeful, the very act of making something new challenges despair. Think about it. A work of art encounters us with new mixtures of sounds, new combinations of colors, new sequences of words, new amalgamations of movements. So human artistry is never creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, but it's creation out of anything, creatio ex aliquo. It's a fashioning of something new out of what currently is. So art is a testimony to the possibility of newness no matter what. That artistry and human creativity are living, breathing alternatives to tragedy and despair. Here's how one theologian puts it, Wendy Farley. She says, the very act of creation is a refusal to accept tragedy as final. Creativity, perhaps paradoxically, allows us to grieve and lament even as it testifies by its very existence to the remnant that survives. Or South African theologian John de Gruchy makes a similar observation. He has a thoughtful study on art and transformation where he says, even when art reflects despair, art expresses the human urge for creativity. And as such, it is indicative of the hope that continually seeks to break through into human consciousness. So to create something is to trust that the future can be different and better than the past. So in all of these ways, I think the arts can be a gift for battered souls because they help us, in this sense, to imagine new possibilities, to move us in wonder, to ask questions like, what if? And they motivate us to live in hope. In the book, particularly in the section on boredom and the ache for beauty within the ordinary, I talk about several practices that I recommend for breathing in beauty as oxygen. One of them, of course, is to keep creating. So just as an encouragement for you artists, if creativity is essentially an act of hope, it's also a way of continuing to access beauty. So I think anytime we encounter beauty, we are moved to bring more of it into the world. And so keep creating is one way to battle these things. But I speak of some other practices as well, and just want to introduce one of those practices for you, which is the practice of breath prayers. Something that I encountered several years ago that has been really transformative for me. And I start with this quote. This is on page 110 of the book by Rachel Carson. She says that if she were a magical fairy, she would give to all children a sense of wonder so indestructible that it would last throughout life, as an unfailing antidote to boredom and disenchantments of later years, sterile preoccupation with things that are artificial, and the alienation from sources of strength. That's quite a prayer, if I've ever heard one. But since we can't count on magical fairies to show up, but by the grace of God, we need wonder habits, is what I call them. We need disciplines of learning how to continue to breathe in beauty, to encounter beauty in our lives so that it can be oxygen. And breath prayer is one of those practices for me, which if you have a practice of prayer in your life, you can just incorporate it into whatever your rhythms of prayer are, praying the portions of the day, praying the hours, whatever the case may be. But breath prayer is great because it's short and it's simple, but it fixes your attention on the beauty before you. So I recommend in the book, for example, before I go into a meeting, I'll say a breath prayer where on the inhale, I simply say, Lord, attune my senses to the beauty of this meeting. And that's it. I mean, I might say it 3 times, 4 or 5 times. I'm saying this silently. Lord, attune my senses to the beauty of this meeting. And, that breath prayer is not going to automatically mean that the coworker that I found annoying last meeting will miraculously cease to be annoying, or that the conversation in the meeting will miraculously be riveting. But no, it tunes my senses to the possibility of beauty in the people that I'm going to meet, in the conversations we're going to have, in the Spirit of God in our midst. So at any moment in your day, at any transition, you can incorporate breath prayer to tune your senses back to the possibility of beauty in that moment, in that day, in that task that you're about to undertake. And I would commend it to you. Along with other practices in the book, I talk about Sabbath keeping. I talk about simply going outside. And this is what I do to my kids when they're bored. Say, well, you can whine outside as well, but I think that your wonder muscles are going to start working if you go outside, and it often works. So I think those practical ways of breathing in beauty are important, and encourage you to talk more about that just as a group. But I wanted to end my time in talking to you about this topic with how I end the book, which is essentially how beauty can save our lives, because the stakes are high. And there's this famous but often misunderstood phrase, beauty will save the world. Many folks know it comes from a novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky, his novel, The Idiot. But it's often misunderstood because it's not a statement in the book. It arises in the section in Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, where Ippolit, who's an atheist, is asking Prince Mishkin, is it true that you once said that beauty will save the world? And he's trying to trap him because Ippolit thinks that Prince Mishkin only believes in the salvific power of beauty because he's in love. And so Ippolit's trying to dismantle that idea. And Prince Mishkin doesn't initially answer that question, or at least not directly. And so Ippolit tries again, and he asks another question. What sort of beauty will save the world? That's the question that he asks. And again, Prince Mishkin doesn't directly answer the question. He kind of lets beauty remain this riddle in the story, which is amazing. We could talk more about that. But I love that question. What sort of beauty will save the world? I think it's the right question. Can a beauty that is simply of the world save the world? And what do we mean by saved, right? Saved from despair, saved from doldrums and boredom, saved from death. And I think it's possible to talk about that on two different levels, and that's how I end the book. That on the one hand, it's fitting to talk about the power of natural and artistic beauty to save the world, to save us now from a meaningless and despairing experience of this life. And this is a contact point with any human being. And I think this is likely what Mary Oliver meant when she told Krista Tippett in an interview. She said, I got saved by poetry. I got saved by the beauty of the world. And what she's talking about is how, despite a very difficult childhood, how the beauty of the woods and the beauty of words gave Mary Oliver's life purpose and inspired her to bring more beauty into the world, which she did as a poet and as an essayist. So for beauty to save in that way is to claim natural and artistic beauty as oxygen for a life of meaning and a life of joy, despite all the troubles, despite the challenges of buffered and battered and bored existence. No beauty, the beauty of this world will not magically erase trauma and pain, but it can give strength for each day. Beauty will not eliminate injustice, but it can provide hope beyond current circumstances. Beauty won't ease all the tensions of a buffered life, but it can introduce anyone to a sense of wonder and enchantment that can be a bridge to the sacred. And in this sense, beauty can save any person at any time. And every time it does, the world looks and feels a little bit brighter. And I love talking about that as a contact point with anyone, uh, Christian, non-Christian, religious or not. Beauty has power in this way. And that's a big part of my story as well. And that artistic beauty can have similar impact, especially in a context that's just full of this growing recognition of unsettling contingency, this gnawing of dis-ease, the erosion of old certainties, that art is not some kind of messianic fix or a panacea for the greater demons of our nature, but it can provide at least a point of departure. It's what one theologian says, a point of departure, a way to not simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice, but rather to drive a lance or even throw oneself into the spokes of the wheel itself. Even if art can't save us or the world from ultimate demise, it can save us from apathy and resignation. And one poet, novelist, Erica Jong, she expresses this tension of what poetic beauty can and cannot do. And I include this little snippet in the book, that no poem will unwrite lawsuits, unseat senators, or unbribe judges. If you and I and all the poets in the world write poems hourly, no cancer will ungrow. But we write poems as leaves give oxygen so we can breathe. So I think that's true. And if beauty can save a soul from despair in this life, my question that I end the book with is can beauty also save us from death itself? And to be fair, most Christian theologians deny that possibility if by beauty we mean the beauty of created things, and the beauty of nature, the beauty of artistry. So a theologian like N.T. Wright will say, no, the beauty of created things cannot save us, but it is a broken signpost of the one who does. Or even C.S. Lewis, some of you may be familiar with, argued that our longing for created beauty reveals our underlying desire for uncreated beauty, for calls a distant country, one in which we will become the beauty that we experience here and now. So they are right in the sense that beauty given or made must be saved from itself in order to be given back to us as oxygen. And I believe only God can save the world from ultimate tragedy. But to the extent that God is beauty, then yes, the world will be saved by beauty, which in this case is the beauty of an eternal being who is simultaneously beauty and the beautifier and the beautifulness of the world. And this is a beauty that exists beyond the world, but also entered the world through the person of Jesus, who lived a beautiful life, was riven in death, rose again, ascended to heaven, sent the Spirit as the beauty agent in the world to bring a whole new creation to life. So yes, beauty will save the world, but the sort of beauty that will save the world ultimately is a Trinitarian beauty. It's a revealed beauty, incarnate beauty, cruciform beauty, resurrected beauty, ascended beauty, spirited beauty. And ultimately that kind of beauty is foolishness to the world. Because as I've already talked about, it goes belonging to death as well as resurrected life. Chris Green states that there can be no redemption without the death of beauty in hell and its subsequent resurrection, which is a paradox. It's a mystery. It's at the heart of the Christian faith. If that's true, then the world will be saved, and you and I can only be saved by dying and rising to new life with beauty. Let me just end with more poetry. Like I said, poets are my companions thinking about this. And I think whether thinking about the power of beauty to save us in this life or the next, I love what Polish American poet Czesław Miłosz reminds us in his poem One More Day. It's a long poem. This is just the last two stanzas. He says this: though the good is weak, beauty is very strong. Non-being sprawls everywhere. It turns into ash, whole expanses of being. It masquerades in shapes and colors that imitate existence, and no one would know it if they did not know that it was ugly. And when people cease to believe that there is good and evil, only beauty will call to them and save them, so that they will know how to say, this is true and that is false. So, my friends, God's beauty whispers and roars through this world in both ordinary and surprising ways. It's a beauty that entices us to believe, to move beyond the suffocating boundaries of a buffered existence. It's a beauty that brings hope and healing despite all the troubles and the trauma we carry. It's a beauty that stirs up wonder within our ordinary and sometimes monotonous lives, and it compels us to risk more love and more creativity. So beauty is oxygen, and there is more than enough to go around. Thanks for letting me speak at you. Hello again, friends. It was such a joy to be with you last week and to talk about beauty. And I heard that it stirred up some good discussion and some questions, and I'm grateful for that as well. And I thought I would just take a few minutes to address some of those questions that came up and just say a few more words of clarification and encouragement, hopefully. So starting with this question, does art have to reference ugliness, the ugliness of reality to bring healing? And what I want to say about that is not that every work of art needs to grapple with ugliness or evil or the scars of our existence, but the presence of ugliness and evil should be accounted for in the arc of an artist's work or in the art that we're engaging with over time. Think, for example, of the kind of music we hear and sing in churches. If churches only produced and sang music about light and joy and thanksgiving and adoration, would that be adequate? In other words, does that express and communicate and grapple with the whole range of human experience and help us participate in the reality of God's story? I think the answer is no. I think we need to have music and songs that help us express and experience all of life, from the deepest laments to the greatest songs of joy. And I think the Psalms are a great example of this kind of art because they engage with all of life, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Of course, about a third of the Psalms are laments, often asking really hard questions and expressing honest and dark emotions, engaging with the ugliness. And that's the kind of expression and engagement in my mind that will bring true healing. So again, not that every work of art needs to do everything, but that the full gamut of art needs to express and engage with all of that. Okay, the next question was, does beauty sometimes increase our sorrow rather than heal, such as listening to too much melancholy music when feeling down? Yes, beauty and the beauty of the arts can increase our sorrow, which can be a good thing or a dangerous thing, depending on the situation. Sometimes beauty can expose certain emotions like sorrow when our temptation is to ignore it or try to shove that emotion under the rug, so to speak. And so the arts can be formative in this way by exposing emotions so that we can deal with them and move toward healing. However, there is a danger, which I think this question is getting at, related to wallowing in certain emotions or letting them overtake you. So if you are particularly prone to melancholy, if you're in a depressive season, then there needs to be wisdom and discernment in terms of what kind of art you're experiencing, because there is a danger of being drawn deeper into a state that you actually want to escape. In that case, it's not a sentimental urge that might lead you to listening to more joyful music, but actually an awareness of what your heart and your mind might need to come fully awake and alive. The next question starts by saying you contrasted beauty with sameness. Is diversity the only pathway towards beauty? And there was an example of the endless cornfields in the Midwest here in America that can be just as beautiful as the jagged mountains near Stellenbosch. Diversity is always present and is an essential feature of beauty. Why? Because diversity is who God is a part of who God is as the source of beauty. God is not merely one being, unified being. God is one being in three dimensions. God is a diversified unity, which is the essence of beauty. The world, as the overflow of God's beauty, then bears the mark of diversified unity. And even in cornfields, to take that example, there is both. There is unity and diversity. There is a vast unified stretch of cornfield, but there's the diversity of each stalk. There's the diverse colors, uh, especially where the green meets the blue of the sky, right, or the gray. There's the rolling hills. There's division of fields by roads and fences and windbreaks. Um, my family's from Northwest Iowa and Southwest Minnesota, so I get it. There's a beauty there. But it's because of both the unity and the diversity. And there's diversity wherever we look. Bahar Orang has a marvelous little book called Where Things Touch. The author's name is spelled O-R-A-N-G, Orang. In her book, Where Things Touch, which is not necessarily a religious book, it's not coming from a Christian perspective, but I think it's so wise because she's essentially saying beauty is where things touch. Beauty is a feature of relation, of entanglement, of diversity and unity. And beauty is that because of who God is my argument. And then you had many other wonderful comments as well that I can tell were transformative for you to talk about. I want to just end perhaps with a comment on this last note here about John Cage. And there was this quote: "The first question I ask myself when something doesn't seem to be beautiful is, why do I think it's not beautiful?" And very shortly you discover that there is no reason. And you asked whether this means that if there's no objective ugliness or that beauty can be found in anything and everything. And so that's an interesting and important question, whether or not there is such a thing as objective ugliness. And perhaps it would be helpful to think of ugliness in similar terms to how Augustine considered evil, that evil is privation. If goodness is a solid thing, then evil, Augustine said, is no thing. It's nothing. And Augustine came to this view because if evil had some kind of substantial reality, and God is the creator of all reality, then that would somehow make God the author or origin of evil. But God is not the source of evil. Therefore, evil is a form of nothingness. And I think something similar could be said of ugliness. Ugliness is like the hole in the middle of the donut. I don't know if donuts are a thing in South Africa, but they're all the rage here in Charlotte. And my children actually asked me the other day, Dad, why is there a hole in the middle of the donut? Why don't we just get a whole donut without holes? And I said something silly like, well, I suppose the hole in the donut makes you appreciate the rest of it more or something. But the essence of that is, ugliness in some ways, or the lack of beauty, helps us appreciate where beauty really is. But it's just the lack of beauty. It's nothingness in a sense. And I said in the talk last week that beauty is everywhere, just like oxygen. But perhaps it's more accurate to say that beauty can emerge from everywhere, precisely because God is on a mission to make things new. God's work of beauty, God's work of beautiful creation was not merely a thing in the beginning, in the past, but is an ongoing process. And God, by his grace, can bring beauty out of the nothingness of ugliness. And when God does this work, the beauty that emerges is the beauty that can accommodate scars. So I hope that helps. Again, it was wonderful to be with you. Hope we can stay in dialogue. Grace and peace to you.